Hey y'all, welcome to another video lecture. So for this week, we're looking at Henry Jenkins' work on Star Trek, and specifically his article, Star Trek Rerun, Reread, and Rewritten. So this is another look at audiences and receptions, and in particular, Jenkins is interested in fandom, right? What it means to be a fan. So to begin, I try and give you a little background on each one of the authors that we deal with. So this is Henry Jenkins, and his work centers on television fans, particularly science fiction fans, and he's a fan himself. And we see, he tells us in the article about how he got into studying fandom, and how this was sort of an outgrowth of him being a fan himself. So he says, when I got to graduate school, I was struck by how impoverished the academic framework for thinking about media spectatorship was. Uh, and he says, I was lucky enough to get to study under John Fiske, who introduced me to the cultural studies perspective. So here we see clearly the evidence of the influence of John Fiske, who we've read. And he says, out of this tension between academic theory and fan experience emerged this essay, Star Trek Reread, Rerun, and Rewritten. And later he used this to write a very well-known book in the field of communication studies called Textual Poachers, Television Fans, and Participatory Culture. He begins his exploration of fandom by citing a Newsweek article that he had read. And he says, with its relentless focus on conspicuous consumption and infantile, quote, infantile behavior, and its patronizing language and smug superiority to all fan activity, the Newsweek article presents a really negative view or depiction of fandom. And he says, in the context of this article, which is somehow representative of the larger take on fandom, he says fans are characterized as kooks, obsessed with trivia, celebrities, and collectibles, as misfits and crazies, and as, quote, a lot of overweight women, a lot of divorced and single women. So, what Jenkins is getting at here is the idea that fans, right, particularly fans of science fiction, are looked at as a kind of problem to be solved by the media. And of course, there's also a kind of gendered criticism here as well that should not go unrecognized. So he says this was sort of, this Newsweek article presents kind of the popular media portrayal of fandom, but he says academic writers approach fans in a similar fashion. There was a fair amount of literature that suggested that the hardcore fans were attempting to return to childhood. It's kind of an infantile regression. This view of fandom as a kind of mindless pleasure. And of course, Jenkins, as a fan himself, wants to argue against these views and wants to point out that fandom is itself a much more nuanced and complicated kind of thing. So he quickly gets on to this idea of poaching, right, of textual poaching. And this is what his later book is about. But the basic idea behind poaching is that, fans are able to go to these texts and pick out the things that they like, that they sort of lay a claim to the various components or elements of the stories and the shows and the movies and so on. And stake out their territory, so to speak, kind of steal the ideas that they like. So he tells us, rejecting aesthetic distance, fans passionately embrace favored texts and attempt to integrate media representations within their own social experience. So this should remind you of Hall and Fiske and so on. And he says, like cultural scavengers, fans reclaim works that others regard as worthless and trash, finding them a rewarding source of popular capital. Reading becomes a type of play. And so the play then, right, the play elements that he's talking about the poaching, which is an idea that he takes from Desserteau. And he says, Desserteau represents this as an impertinent raid on the literary preserve that takes away only those things that seem useful or pleasurable to the reader. So again, this is the idea that we all come from different sort of zones of lived experience. And we come to these relatively open or producerly texts, and we take away the things that are meaningful to us. And so then he also incorporates in his play this idea of bricolage, which is something that we've talked about before. And he says in the practical arts and the fine arts, bricolage, which is French for tinkering, is the construction or creation of a work from a diverse range that happens to be available, or a work created by such a process. So these are some examples of bricolage, right, where people sort of glom onto the things that are around them and then use these things to create their own text, their own kind of art. So here you see a sculpture made out of shopping carts. Here you see another sculpture that's rendered out of various pieces of refuse that someone found, either at the dump or at the side of the road. On the famous God Save the Queen Sex Pistols cover, you see the same sort of idea, cutting out various words from different magazines and newspapers and pasting them rather together with a picture of the Queen. Here we see, I believe this was Stomp, the musical, where we have people, instead of playing musical instruments, playing the trash cans and so on that were available to them on the street. And here with the punk kind of 1970s Britain depiction that we see here. You see how this young lady uses, obviously kind of repugnant images of Nazi Germany, as well as clothespins, safety pins, and so on, in order to create this kind of nihilistic punk aesthetic, right? And so all these things kind of go together, and what's happening is that the people are coming to, in some sense, create something out of the things that are available to them. And so Jenkins says this is kind of the way that fandom works. And so he tells us, far from viewing consumption as imposing meanings upon the public, Desserteau suggests consumption involves reclaiming textual material, making it one's own, appropriating or reappropriating it. But there's a caveat here. He says, yet such wanton conduct cannot be sanctioned. It must be contained, through ridicule if necessary, since it challenges the very notion of literature as a type of private property to be controlled by the textual producers and their academic interpreters. So it's important at this point for me to point out that one of the major themes that Jenkins looks at in this particular essay is the idea of fan fiction. Now, this is something many of you may be familiar with already, but fan fiction involves fans taking characters and elements from their favorite stories, like Star Trek, for example, and then writing their own stories using these characters. So what they're doing here, in some sense, a la Desserteau, is they're taking the elements that they like from these texts and appropriating them, right? Making them their own. And putting these characters in their own stories. But at the same time, what Jenkins is getting at here is that this kind of conduct challenges, right, the private property that's controlled by the textual producers, by the authors and creators of these things, and their academic interpreters, because what's happening is that people are putting their own spin on established texts, right, stealing elements, combining them together in a kind of bricolage, poaching their favorite elements, and then combining it in a form of bricolage to create entirely new stories, right? And so he says the reaction to this is oftentimes a kind of ridicule, like we see here, right? Star Trek fans, because sex is overrated. I mean, this is clearly it's kind of a humorous joke, but nevertheless points to how ridicule is used to kind of contain this effort to appropriate the texts and use them in different ways. So he tells us, in this essay I propose an alternative approach to fan experience, one that perceives Trekkers, so he's talking about Star Trek fans, not as cultural dupes, social misfits, or mindless consumers, but rather as poachers of textual meaning. So again, he's not, he wants to challenge the idea that's presented in that Newsweek article that fans are just these kinds of mindless, infantile people, and say rather, they're not, and that indeed what they're doing is they're poaching the things they like from these texts that are meaningful to them, and then creating new things out of it. And so as a result, what they do is they create new kinds of fan communities. And fandom itself becomes a vehicle for a subculture, for these groups, to pry open space for their cultural concerns within dominant representations, a way of appropriating media texts and rereading them in a fashion that serves different interests, a way of transforming mass culture into popular culture. So here again, we see reminders of what we've read up until this point. And so this is an interesting kind of take on that falls somewhere between Fiske's idea of popular culture and the Adorno and Horkheimer Frankfurt School version of popular culture, right? Adorno and Horkheimer said that popular culture wasn't popular at all and that it was imposed from above. John Fiske says, well, we make popular culture, right, out of the text that we're given, and we decide what becomes popular. But what's happening is that Jenkins is falling somewhere in between. What he's saying is that they take elements from mass culture, from these shows and so on that the gatekeepers present us with, but fandom in particular then turns these into popular culture by poaching the elements that they like and creating new works from it. Okay, so that sort of answers this final question, which is how does the last quote refer back to Fiske's conceptualization of mass culture? Now, there are some rules that operate within these fan communities. And this also has to do with sort of, well, not sort of, but with copyright and the idea of ownership of cultural texts and so on. So this first quote here, he tells us, no legalistic notion of literary property can adequately constrain the rapid proliferation of meaning surrounding a popular text. Yet there are other constraints, ethical constraints, and self-imposed rules that are enacted by the fans, either individually or part of a larger community, in response to their felt need to legitimate their unorthodox appropriation of mass media texts. All right, so let's unpack this. What does this mean? Well, he says, first off, copyright and so on can't really keep the fans from making meaning out of these texts in different ways, right? You can't stop them from poaching and creating their own text. Ownership of a particular text, even beyond that, doesn't prevent you from interpreting it in a variety of ways. But he says, within the community itself and amongst the fans as individuals, there are other constraints. There are other kinds of rules. And in essence, what he's referring to here is a kind of moral economy that exists within fandom itself. And he says the fans have rules for how they appropriate these materials. And indeed, the fans often cast themselves not as poachers, but as loyalists, rescuing essential elements of the primary text misused by those who maintain copyright control over the program materials. So what he's suggesting here is that the fans feel a great kind of emotional connection to these texts. It's what we would call a kind of affective connection to the texts. And indeed, they think the story should be told in a way that is consistent with the kinds of meanings that they're making out of it, right? And so, they don't think of themselves as poachers, as stealing these characters and using them in different ways, but rather they think of themselves as loyalists, as people who in some way are correcting some of the problems that exist within the realm of the copyright holders and so on. We see this all the time, right? So to give you a practical example of this, the most recent Star Wars trilogy, there are a lot of hardcore Star Wars fans who look at that trilogy and feel as if the copyright holders, in this case Disney, who bought it from Lucasfilm, are pursuing the series and telling stories that are not faithful to the kind of interpretations that these hardcore fans have made based on the other films, right? And so in some sense, what they're doing is by creating their own stories using these characters and narrative elements, is telling a story that they feel is loyal to the original canon, right, to the original series. And that in some ways it's kind of a corrective to the direction that Disney took the program in, if that makes sense. So, in terms of what is a fan, right, or the definition of a fan, because this is clearly something that Jenkins is grappling with, he says one becomes a fan not by being a regular viewer of a particular program, but by translating that viewing into some sort of cultural activity. So this is an important distinction here, right? So he wants to say that fandom is more than just being a loyal viewer or reader, a loyal spectator. Rather, it's about taking that program and turning it into a cultural activity by sharing feelings and thoughts about the program's contents with friends, by joining a community of other fans who share common interests, and so on, right? So for Jenkins, it's more than just watching the text. It's making the text a kind of participatory, communal experience, right? It's taking it to another level. And he says when it gets taken to that level, that's when fandom begins. That's when you become a fan, right? Okay, so this might be useful as well. This is about a 4-minute video from howstuffworks.com on fandom. And so this gives a neat little kind of overview of Jenkins and his thinking that extends beyond just this particular article. So let's check this out.
Namaste. I'm Christian Sager, and welcome to Brain Stuff. As human beings, none of us are strangers to being part of a community. We all have the psychological need to feel safe, respected, and wanted. So we form social relations with other people, usually based on our values and beliefs. It used to be that our communities were always based on our physical proximity to one another. Now, with the growth of mass media, you can find communities of people separated by vast distances who build social structures based on their common interests and similar content. When it comes down to it, almost everyone's a fan of something, right? So then, how does fandom work? Who runs these communities and what makes them different from my neighborhood book club? For the answers to these questions, there's one man to turn to. Henry Jenkins has been studying fandom for decades, first at MIT and now at the University of Southern California. Jenkins' first point about fandom is something we've already touched on, that it constitutes a kind of alternative social community for people. You can apply this to Brain Stuff in the community built around our videos and social media. Every day I see people contributing something new to our explanations of the everyday world. Often, you are helping us all learn more by sharing your personal experience or knowledge about the topics that we cover. And Jenkins says that fans have a very distinct way of receiving the content that they adore, usually with undivided attention. You know that one television show you watch where you won't pick up the phone or answer the door when it's on? That's what he's talking about. And fans aren't just faithful consumers. They also want to talk about it with other fans as it's happening. Here at Brain Stuff, we've got viewers who will watch and comment on a video in the first 10 minutes after it goes live. You know, the people who write first or under 301 in the comments? That's what Jenkins means when he says fans receive content differently than everyone else. Fans can be some of the strongest critics if they're disappointed in their object of fandom. Don't believe me? Check out how many people said our Twins episode wasn't funny. I wrote that one, by the way. Or the conversations about whether Lauren uses a teleprompter or not. It's true, she's just really awkward, naturally. Now, personally, we love it when fans get engaged like this. It usually means that you care enough about what we're doing that you want to make sure it's done well. Finally, in Jenkins' model, fandom actually constitutes its very own world of art, with a functioning market and awards evaluating their aesthetics. Fans create everything. Videos, poems, paintings, sculptures, songs, short stories, podcasts, you name it. But here's the thing. The corporations that own those brands don't usually like it when someone else starts making money off their intellectual property. And then you get into all kinds of arguments about copyright and whether fan art falls under transformative fair usage. But don't worry, Ben and I know about the slash fiction you're posting about us, and we're not going to sue anybody. In fact, maybe one day you could write an episode of Brain Stuff for us. Because that is another important thing about fan art. It's often a training ground for up-and-coming creators. Consider this. Peter Capaldi, the guy who is now playing Doctor Who, used to write letters to the creators of the show when he was only 15 years old. Now he's the star of the show, playing the character he loved so much growing up. And this is why foundations and media companies are following Henry Jenkins' research so closely. Because fandom's influence on the media is growing considerably. Back at the turn of the 20th century, it was fans writing letters to Arthur Conan Doyle that motivated him to return to writing Sherlock Holmes. Today, movies like Veronica Mars and Serenity are being produced because of fan campaigns. When the market shifted from satellite to cable television, fans were targeted by networks as the ideal media consumers, especially when DVD box sets came out and binge-watching television series became common practice. Now, even after a show gets canceled, fans continue engagement with the product. So now that we all know a little bit more about how fandom works, what are you a fan of? I mean, besides brain stuff, of course. What's your fan community like, or do you make art for your fandom? Let me know in the comments below, and I'll try to engage with you there about it. And don't forget, every good fan subscribes to our channel so they know the minute we've posted a new episode.
Okay, so that presents us with a kind of overview of Jenkins, a very quick one, that describes some of his basic ideas and lets you know where he goes with many of the concepts that he establishes in this particular piece. So, whoops, sorry about that. So he goes on and he says, as the last video mentioned, right, that fandom is part of community, right, and subcultural community specifically. And he talks about his own personal experiences as a Star Trek fan and the kind of bonds that he formed through his fandom. So he says, I met one girl who liked some of the TV shows I liked, but I was otherwise a bookworm, no friends. Then my friend and I met some other girls ahead of us, but gaga over Star Trek. We met each Friday night to watch Star Trek together. Silence was mandatory, and afterwards we discussed each episode. We rewrote each story and corrected the wrongs done to our guys by the writers. We memorized bits of dialogue. Excuse me. We even started to write our own adventures. So there's a lot to unpack here, right? I mean, number one, there's this idea of community and connection that people find over texts that help them form new communities, right? Particularly here where, Jenkins describes being isolated and kind of feeling alone, but it's through the show, right, and through fandom that he establishes social connections and builds a community around him. And then, also we see here, right, certain rules. So, for example, when watching the show, you have to be quiet. Afterwards, that's when you get to discuss what's happening. And then, interestingly, he says we rewrote each story and corrected the wrongs done to our guys by the writers. So clearly there's this sense of connection or even a sense of ownership, right? An emotional connection with the characters in the show. And a very clear kind of idea about how those characters should behave and operate within the narrative world. And then there's also this kind of, arguably excessive commitment. We memorized bits of dialogue and even started to write our own adventures. So in writing their own adventures, what they're doing, of course, is appropriating these materials, poaching, right? And then performing an act of bricolage where they take these elements that are around them, these media elements, and construct new stories. So here, again, more emphasis on belonging. I walked into that Lunicon and felt like I had come home without ever realizing I had been lost. I had met folks who were just as nuts as I was. I had a wonderful time. So again, as my title of the slide up here suggests, right, there's this idea that Jenkins and other fans are moving from a kind of isolation to community, and the community is built around texts. And of course, as I've suggested at other points in this semester, that community is regularly built around texts, around media signs and symbols, stories that bind us together. And it's doing so here on a smaller scale than something like the Bible and Christianity, right? Because obviously that creates a Christian community around this one specific book. Here we have a Star Trek community that's much smaller, but arguably equally enthusiastic, and it's a subcultural community that's built around a popular culture text. All right, so he explores the sort of the phenomenology of fandom here, right? And he says fan slang draws a sharp contrast between the mundane, the realm of everyday experience, and those who dwell exclusively within that space, and fandom. an alternative sphere of cultural experience that restores the excitement and freedom that must be repressed to function in ordinary life. So, obviously what he's getting at here is that, fandom, becoming part of this community, creates a kind of new world for people, right? That they find more exciting and free because they're able to talk about things, that are shared interests in ways that they couldn't in their normal everyday life. So he goes on, he says, not only does mundane, quote unquote, mean everyday life, it's also a term used to describe narrow-minded pettiness, judgmental conformity, and a shallow and silly nature. It's used by people who feel very alienated from society. So, the mundanity, right? The mundane is, in some sense, everyday life, but it's even more than that, right? It's, in a sense, it's a description of people who don't share the joy and the enthusiasm that the fan community does, right? And that indeed many of these people, particularly within his fandom, the Star Trek fandom, view themselves as alienated from normal society. And so, in some sense, then, it's easy to understand how being part of this subculture, this Star Trek fandom subculture, that they feel much more contented, right? They feel more edified, and they feel as if this is much more exciting and better in some real way than the kind of everyday life that they normally experience. Okay, I'm going to stop this video here, and I'll pick up with fan writing in the second part, just to keep things a little bit more manageable in terms of size. So thanks for checking this out, and be sure to check out the second half of the video.